So when a lot of people think of sanctuary, I think where a lot of people go immediately is a sort of a religious connotation, or sometimes even Christian connotation. Certainly the Catholic Church is a part of the church. It's called a sanctuary. And a lot of the people, when we think of attaining sanctuary, either for legal reasons, for some people that are charged with an offense and need a place to be in order to process that, or for undocumented people that are potentially going to be chucked out of a country, it offers an opportunity to protect them for a period of time. So we think about this a lot. There is some law wrapped around this coming out of, say, England, but there's also a long tradition of this kind of thing. It's not just a Christian concept. It comes out of probably traditional cultures going back as far as we can imagine, but certainly Greek culture and Roman culture, these cultures provided venues like this, which maybe they used this term sanctuary, or maybe they didn't. But anyway, think about it as sort of a temporary shelter, a place to protect you from either direct violence of some kind or from arrest. So I've equated it here to what we might call negative peace in the overall context of Galton's work. But that's up for debate. But it does protect people from that direct violence. It doesn't necessarily suggest that the greater structure is going to change or there's going to be a transformation out of this, although I'm sure that happens sometimes. So anyway, the way that I went about exploring this is thinking about what are all the different ways we use this term. So one of the ways that we use it is in marine sanctuaries. Barack Obama has done some really good work protecting certain lands in the islands, I guess, and underneath the islands where we have a lot of marine creatures. So we have all kinds of space. He created the biggest national reserve in the history of the U.S. very recently. But this doesn't have a real solid meaning necessarily. It just means that there's certain levels of protection that might vary. Perhaps, for instance, people might be able to fish there depending on their circumstances and how the marine reserve was set up. But this leads to a question, so I thought we could kind of explore together a little bit. But I thought the idea of having a park be a sanctuary. How many people would feel like a park is a sanctuary for them? So animal sanctuaries, and when we think of places that animals go when they've been injured, a lot of times we use the term animal sanctuary. So it's certainly protecting creatures that have been hurt, and maybe even setting up a space for them to get better a lot of times. Here we've got somebody looking after the needs of some chimpanzees. I was on a chimpanzee sanctuary in West Africa when I lived there. We didn't have as much a big medical team, but we did try to provide a little bit of medical help. But anyway, we have this and a lot of times with different creatures that are particularly endangered or vulnerable in a lot of ways. So we've got a monarch grove here. Monarchs are in great danger now with a lot of the changes that have been going on with their huge migration. I don't know if any of you had a chance to read about it, but at any rate, having some sanctuaries for them and having people provide maybe mini sanctuaries in their homes for planting bushes that the caterpillars eat and so on is a really important part of their future survival. So, but we think about it another way. Do animals give us sanctuary? Does anybody feel that way? Okay, so when you're thinking about your special pet in your life, in what ways do you feel like you get sanctuary from them?
They listen.
They listen.
Unconditional love.
Yeah, that's a great thing, especially when we're feeling down, isn't it? So we just heard a little bit about the concept of sanctuary in some respects in British Columbia and Saskatchewan and how that was violated in many respects, but it started out as a potential place for sanctuary. But there's also these, when we're thinking about animals and the natural habitat, there's places that are really important in British Columbia. So I don't know, has anybody ever visited one of these particular sanctuaries in Delta, northern British Columbia, where the grizzly bear one is, or in Valemount, or another space in British Columbia?
There's a bird sanctuary not too far from here in Preston.
Okay. So why is that important? Why bother? Why do we set that up?
Make sure that species stays alive.
Good. There's a lot. I mean, there's a lot of birds and creatures that can benefit. I mean, birds fit into a wider web of relationships. So it's an idea that partly is protecting certain keynote or keystone species, and partly protecting the environment as a whole. So we heard about the dougal-boars here. So I also have a personal story of sanctuary here. My father is a draft dodger, and my parents moved up here, and I was born in British Columbia. I still have ties to the region. My grandmother-in-law is here today, if that's a title. But anyway, but for us, this was a place of refuge from the American government when my dad was drafted. So we experienced it probably in a way that was protective and so on, but there's some elements of sanctuary that were missing for us, which I'll get into a little bit later. So this is a question mark. Do we have sanctuary in academia? I think a lot of us that are professors and so on feel like we want to create this kind of space when we're in our classrooms, providing other kinds of extracurricular activities with our students. I teach a class right now on race and identity in America, but I'm not sure if we achieve that. So I was going to ask you guys, how do you feel about academic spaces? One of the ways that in the United States, anyway, I'm not sure how it's playing out in Canada, but there's a lot of trainings with respect to how the LGBTQ community is treated in the academic setting. There's also a lot of emphasis right now on combating sexual assaults on college campuses. But at any rate, so we're aspiring to this, but how do you guys feel about it? Do you feel like an academic environment can be a place of sanctuary for you? Has anybody ever felt that way?
Yeah, I felt it was always free and open thought and expression. That's how I always felt at university. I look forward to it, and it should remain that way, I hope.
Okay, good. So a protected space for expressing things that you might not ordinarily
What level
do.
of academia you're talking about?
Well, it could be any. I think primarily at the
I
undergraduate,
didn't feel
graduate
safe
level.
in my elementary school.
Okay, so that's a
As
good
a
point.
dougal-boar, I did not feel safe
And why not?
because we were called dirty dukes all my growing up.
Okay, good. So it
The
was,
prejudice and the racism, like in my elementary school, we had about 40 kids. There were 5 or 6 that were not dougal-boar. The dougal-boar kids still felt as a minority.
so when you felt persecuted like that, did you ever go to a place that you felt was sanctuary for you?
Yes, and to our Sunday school meetings, to our community gatherings, yes.
So in particular, vulnerable communities like that really need this, right? It's not an option for people that are persecuted like this. We also might think of it in a very personal way. So if, for instance, we mentioned, so if you get picked on at school, or you feel like you're having a very difficult day, or you're feeling vulnerable, what are some ways that you can generate the feeling of sanctuary in yourself? Does anybody have any personal strategies for that?
I was an abused child by my father. I climbed trees to get away because he couldn't climb trees after me.
Okay, yeah, that's a great point, yeah. Anybody else have a place like that they used as a form of self-preservation?
Sometimes I just withdrawing within.
Okay. So particularly if you're an introverted person, sometimes just processing, getting in a place where you can be alone for a while.
A walk in the forest, being with the trees helps, as you were saying, and also meditation.
Okay, great. And I'm actually, that will lead me to the next down here. So meditation perhaps could be a form of sanctuary. Some people think of their home as a sanctuary. So I'm not talking about the physical space of a house, but where you view at home. So people actually, since I've been here, have been asking me, where's your home? Where's Salisbury? So my house is in Salisbury, but I would say my home is here, because I feel much more like a sense of community that I can understand, and the sense that this is where I grew up and I belong to the land here. So anyway, it's worth considering. If you don't feel like sanctuary is in your home, in your house, you might find another place that you feel more like a home. And there's probably different strategies for that, but I think I'm running short on time, so I'm just going to move on from that. We might also find people that we could experience this concept of sanctuary with. Can anybody think of a person that they feel a sense of sanctuary when they're with them?
Yeah, my grandfather once.
Your grandfather.
Mm-hmm.
And now when you think about him, does it give you the same sense of sanctuary?
Yes.
Okay. Anybody else have a special person in their life they think that way? Probably we all have some of these. I certainly, with my family back in my house in Salisbury, that they give me a sense of sanctuary. So anyway, there's probably different reasons why you feel that way, but I'm going to go on to a formal definition that's kind of emerging out of these different contexts. The state of mind one we kind of already talked a little bit about. I'll just point out a couple things on this before we move on. So I put Wayne Gretzky on here, the great one. It's sort of a Canadian connection, but the idea that when we're doing something we love, maybe that could be a form of sanctuary. And I've been doing a lot of work actually with Viktor Frankl, talking about how he survived concentration camps and having some way to preserve yourself in the midst of absolute atrocity. So sometimes we need to create it within our own minds. We've got some theories that I looked at, things like zones of peace, human needs theory, and liminality coming from anthropology. So this is basically what I've come up with as a working definition, and it is working definition, so it's evolving as I go. I actually thought of a new word that I was going to throw in there this morning. But a social sacred space, hallowed ground, that provides protection from physical, legal, emotional, spiritual, or other forms of harm. This space can be virtual now, increasingly, locational, temporal, like a period of time in your life, or a state of mind. Often a reduction of pressure, stress, or burden, and a suspension of social rules leading to vulnerability. So if you're a vulnerable person, it gives you protection. For other people, it takes them out of the social context that they're in, which might be difficult to deal with for a variety of reasons, and gives them another place. Provides safety for living and expressing one's identity. So I think I mentioned something before about the importance of identity for me, maybe a Canadian identity, British Columbia identity, but also in other forms of sanctuary, being ourselves, having a place where we can feel being a Doukhobor is not going to be perceived as a bad thing, in itself is a big part of what sanctuary is. Frequently this is a place that other people know about. It's that church on the hill or that place, but sometimes if it's your favorite tree you climb, other people may not know about it. Sanctuary is used primarily for individuals and groups who are vulnerable in some way. I mentioned the term vulnerable a lot of times. And sanctuary providers, so this is where I'm getting into the peace building side of things, the people that maybe provide these spaces are especially sensitive to those vulnerabilities. And they meet the needs, so this is human needs theory again, of the people that are seeking sanctuary. And the need not to be judged, I would extend it actually to say it's not just providing a non-judgmental space like your pet might give you, but also the idea that you're validated as a human being. I think is a really important part of it. So these are some areas of peace building that I have applied this concept. And right now, because my restorative justice is close to my heart, I've actually used it to create a new way of thinking about restorative justice. But anyway, that's a separate presentation for the next conference. But anyway, when we talk about restorative justice, that safe, almost sacred space is a big part of what we're trying to achieve in this space of dialogue between people that have been victimized by crime and the people that have perpetrated that crime. And so it requires more than just, let's talk it out, that sort of cognitive interaction, but it requires a holding of the space and the people in a way that they can feel much more themselves, much more able to achieve what they need to in this kind of space. Zones of peace, so in places of war, we need to create these areas. So I have not been to Syria, I don't know anything about that conflict, but I hope, like I have a friend of ours is from Aleppo, and he still has family members there. And I hope they have places that they can find this. And even though you can't have physical safety right in the midst of war like that, hopefully you can have a place that you can at least achieve some semblance of personal safety, personal validation, that kind of thing. But there's more formal settings like that in various conflict zones that provide people with that space. And ideally, then they bring the things that they learn from those spaces back to their everyday life. Probably a lot of us in this conference are well versed in nonviolence and social movements, so they've been conceptualized as one of these spaces where you're encountering people that share the same values as you. You're encountering people where you can just say what you need to say. You don't have to worry about offending anybody because everybody holds similar views. And importantly, it's also physical. People are present for one another. People take one another seriously when they might not get the same treatment by regular society. There's a book about it called Free Spaces. And I went to the University of Minnesota, so by Evans and Boyd from University of Minnesota, so put that in there. Sanctuary cities, we hear them. The United States is going through a lot with respect to immigration with this election cycle, and this concept is under great threat right now, I would say, by the political candidates, in particular one of the political candidates. I'll let you do the math on that. But anyway, there's no formal, every sanctuary city will be a little different. There's no like one model, this is what it is, but it's saying some place for undocumented people to say, well, we're going to try to protect your rights to the best of our ability, and that varies from place to place to place. And we do have them in Canada as well as in the United States. This is another question mark for me. So one of the most vulnerable people in society are the refugees. We're in the midst of the greatest refugee humanitarian crisis that we've faced since World War II. The camps are not particularly pleasant, right? For most, I think most of us that have any kind of, have ever encountered them would say. There's certainly a place for negative peace. Hopefully, there's a lot of women that get sexually abused in these camps and so on. But ideally, we aspire to create a sanctuary there on some level. Now, maybe they don't. So this is maybe my interpretation. So if we were able to, though, if we were able to say, what is sanctuary? Providing hallowed ground for people, protecting people's needs, allowing their identities to be expressed. Maybe how would we do these differently? So that's where I can start applying these concepts to actual peace-building initiatives.
First thing is don't create the word to create so that we have refugees. That's the first step.
That's a great idea. So indefinite sanctuary, so I have a monk walking through the forest. Several of you mentioned forest as a potential place for sanctuary. But one of the ways of thinking about peace being the peace builder is am I able to walk in sanctuary more than just in those moments that I feel vulnerable, but I'm able to do that on an ongoing basis, particularly when you're helping people, but throughout your life. And so that's kind of a question that I had for myself. But yeah, and I think that concept resonates with the idea of, say, your Buddha nature, and from Buddhism, right? That each individual has a good part of themselves, whether they present that or not. Or my work with reading Viktor Frankl, it's that same idea that the spirit inside of us is always good. You could be a serial murderer. Hitler, he was clearly somebody who wasn't his favorite person as he lived through concentration camps, but he felt like at his core there was a spirit that was good, and he just couldn't access it. So it kind of fits along the same line. And then I think I have one more slide. So this is my family. We did a family visit to Kootenai National Park this year. In Radium, there's a good sign there that I thought fit very well with this presentation. The mountains shall bring peace to the people. So mountains for me are a source of sanctuary. There's no mountains in Salisbury. So again, it's sort of disconnection from my house and my home. But it seems sanctuary gives people a chance to be themselves, a chance to regroup, gain perspective, and get stronger in the face of great challenges. A lot of times they're going to have to re-enter those societies or the situation that they've found threatening. But when they re-enter it, hopefully the time they spend in sanctuary will make them stronger. But I think I've extended my time long enough, so I'll leave it there and we can talk about it more afterwards, hopefully.